Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our series where we are examining the real story of Noah's flood. I hope that you've had a great week so far, and I appreciate you joining me today. Today's study is going to be a little bit shorter because this is sort of an interlude between what we read last week and the bigger narrative about Noah that we're getting into. But I wanted to take this week and just clean up a little bit of a mess that I left last week. All right, now let me start this way. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was a physician. You've probably heard of his name. As a physician, he was very interested in the use of ether. And you've got to know that ether at this point was used to put patients to sleep if they were going to have surgery. And Holmes wanted to know what it was like for his patients who had to be put to sleep using ether. So once he administered a dose to himself. And while he was going under in a dreamy state, he suddenly had a profound thought. And it's like when he had it, he believed that he had grasped like the key to all the mysteries of the universe. Like God had just shown him something so profound. But when he regained consciousness, he could not remember what it was. And that just drove him crazy because he knew that it was something important. He was right there and he had lost it. And because he knew this was a really big deal, he had thought of something so profound, he decided to re-administer a dose, but this time he had a stenographer come in the room with him, and he told the person, if I tell you, I want you to just write down what I say so that I have a record of this great thought. And as he was going under, sure enough, this thought came back again. It's this great insight. And he mumbled the words as he went to sleep. The stenographer wrote them down, and when Holmes came to, he asked the stenographer, did you get it all? And the stenographer said, yes, I did. And he said, well, would you please read what I wrote? And this is what she read, quote, the entire universe is permeated with a strong odor of turpentine. That's what Holmes muttered as he went to sleep. The entire universe is permeated with a strong odor of turpentine. And somehow in that moment, that was what he believed was the key to all the mysteries of the universe. Now see, there's a piece of me in a weird way that identifies with that story because over the years as I've done Bible study, there have been certain points in time when I've thought, man, I am right on the brink of something big. There's a mysterious passage in Scripture, but I think I finally understand it. And then a few years later, I'll look back at what I taught back in those days or at some notes I made, and I'll realize just how unprofound I was at that time. And I'm pretty sure one day when we all get to heaven, we're going to realize how far off we are on some of the things that we believe and the things that we hold on to so tightly. The Bible is not easy. And by the way, one thing that Bill McKenzie, my mentor, used to say all the time is that the most important things in Scripture are really not that difficult. In fact, Bill espoused something he called 5-minute theology, and I always appreciated this. Bill said that anything that God really wanted us to understand, He made so easy that you should be able to explain it in 5 minutes or less. And if you can't explain it in 5 minutes or less, it's probably not essential. I think that's a pretty good thought. But the Bible is deep, and we can never find the bottom, and some things are more like 5 millennium theology. I mean, there's some things in Scripture that it's like we are never going to completely grasp on this earth, and that's okay, because those are probably things that are too big for us anyway. But today, we're going to just mess for a minute with one of those things, all right? Now, let me remind you where we were last week. We started this story last week by reading 2 chapters of genealogy. And of course, genealogy for me, when I have tried to read through the Bible before, I'll get to certain chapters and I just kind of skim through them. You know, genealogy, it's all those names, are they really that important? But there was so much insight in this genealogy because it is a genealogy that goes from the Garden of Eden right up to Noah's flood. And there's 2 chapters of this. Moses, who wrote Genesis, gives us in chapter 4 the line of Cain. Cain's descendants. And you remember Cain and Abel from the Garden of Eden, and Cain had really gone wayward, and his descendants also went wayward. They were very ungodly. Now, on the other hand, they accomplished big things. They built cities, and they were making tools, and they were making scientific breakthroughs. There were good things happening, but they were very ungodly. And then out of all of Adam's children, All of Adam and Eve's children, there was one line that really seemed to be carrying the truth, and that was the line of Seth. And Seth's line was worshiping God. They had their eyes on Him, and this is really, if you can think about it in these terms, this is the line of the Messiah. Because remember, God had promised Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, one day, Eve, you're going to have an offspring. I mean, one day you're going to have an ancestor that is going to stomp this serpent's head and crush it. In other words, there is a Messiah coming. And the line of Seth was really the vehicle for that. It was the line of the Messiah. So it was very important. This is the remnant that God had on a very wicked earth. And so as we read through these genealogies, we're seeing how the truth stays alive. We also saw last week a picture of God's judgment. You remember Enoch, who walked with God. I mean, here's this guy who walked with God, and God took him from the earth. Also, Enoch had a grandson named Methuselah, and his name literally meant, when he dies, it will come. And we said last week that Methuselah was really a picture of grace, because this is somebody who was born as a precursor to judgment. When he dies, judgment is coming, and yet he is the answer to the trivia question, who lived the longest of anybody in Scripture? It's Methuselah. God held back His wrath. He was patient. He didn't want people to perish. All right, so last week we talked about this progression of time as already on a very young earth, people are turning away from God. Now, let me pause to say this. As we read through the next few chapters, some parts of this are going to be very tough, and I need you to know where I stand on this, all right? I know the book of Genesis has all kinds of different voices, and people approach it a different way. I am a Bible guy. And also, my faith kind of operates like this. I believe in science. I believe in study. I don't think you have to check your brain at the door to be a Christian. There's nothing like that. But I also believe that if there's something that's really hard to understand, the onus to understand it is on me. I don't think that makes God wrong. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean that somehow God meant it differently. I let God speak for Himself. This is the way I approach the Bible. I let God speak for Himself, and then I do my best to understand what God is trying to say. So when it comes to the story of the flood, for instance, I don't somehow try to explain away, well, maybe the flood was just a local thing, maybe it didn't affect as many people, maybe it's all symbolic. I don't do that. I let God speak for Himself. I think that's what God expects us to do. So our job when we read this is not maybe necessarily to understand every little nuance of how it happened. I'm not sure we can understand that, but our job is to understand why God did what He did if we can, and why God is telling us about those things. And I don't think we need to get too dogmatic on certain parts of this. I mean, much like Revelation, there's certain things that we probably just can't get our mind around yet. In the first part of Genesis 6, there's one of those things. All right, and I don't have a TV screen behind me today, but I hope you have your Bible. If you don't, this will be a great time to pause and go get it. We're going to read a few verses together. Genesis chapter 6. Listen to these first 4 verses because these are crazy. All right, here's what it says. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now these are very weird verses, very strange, and honestly, I'm not sure that any of us can really interpret these well. There's been a lot of fights that I've heard. I know that some of you have some very entrenched beliefs. If you're a Bible student and you've studied these before, remember there's nothing essential in these verses. This certainly doesn't fit into 5-minute theology, but it's kind of fun to step back and think about what is God trying to say to us there. all right, because there's a lot of confusion around this, and rightfully so. If any of you have seen the Hollywood movie of Noah a few years ago, which I wasn't really a great fan of, but in that movie, they depicted these Nephilim almost like big monsters made of rock. I don't know if you remember this, but they were like giants. I mean, they looked like some sci-fi creatures, these sci-fi giants made of rock. And at the end of that movie, one of these giants like held on to the ark so that when the water receded, he had lived, and I guess he would live on in the ages to come. It's just, there are some very weird interpretations of these things, and they are extreme. One of the most common arguments that I hear, and I know that some of you really hold on to this, and I'm not going to tell you you're wrong necessarily, even though I don't really believe this way, but what a lot of people think is that this is a reference to fallen angels. That somehow when Satan fell and these angels fell with him, like Isaiah talks about, that some of these fallen angels maybe took on the form of humans. And they lived here on the earth, and they took earthly wives, and they came together, and in their unions, they produced basically like demigods. I mean, wouldn't that be what that is? It's kind of like in Roman mythology that they produced demigods, these big giants. One of the big arguments that people use for that comes from the book of Job, because this phrase, the sons of God, in the book of Job literally means angels. That's how Job described angels, the sons of God. And so a lot of people argue that the author of Genesis, Moses here, is saying that fallen angels and human women came together and they formed this race of basically demigods, that maybe this is even the basis for Roman mythology, that they had this race of demigods, and that God looked at this and said, all right, it's gone far enough, I'm going to have to start over. If you buy into that, I've got some very good friends that really believe this, and if that's what you believe, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, because there's a lot in the world that's over my head. But that's not what I read here, and I don't buy that for a couple of reasons. And the first isn't just because it's so fantastic to imagine. The first reason I don't buy into it is because in the book of Matthew, Jesus implied that angels don't marry and don't reproduce. And so if you just start right there, I'm not even sure that, I don't know that we know everything about angels, but I'm not even sure how possible that would be. But also for me, I look at the placement of this in Genesis 6, right after Genesis 4 and 5, and I think there is a connection between the line of Cain and the line of Seth and what Moses is saying here in the beginning of Genesis 6. See, I think that in this case, the daughters of God, the sons of God, I think that is the godly men of the Sethite line. I think that is in this remnant that God had been keeping. Through the line of Seth, there were these godly men, and I think these godly men started to lust after women who were not godly. I mean, I think this is the idea, that it's kind of like what happened to the Israelites in later years, when the Israelites started to intermarry, and then suddenly they were worshiping different gods. I think in this case, what's happening is that Seth's ancestors, this line of the Messiah, started to intermarry and fall away, and that before you knew it, you had a new generation, that their children, this new generation, was a generation that was very violent and very radical. I think they just straight turned away from God. So that chapter 4 describes the ungodly line of Cain. In chapter 5, we see the godly Sethite line. In Israel, separation at this point was they were just trying to fan into flames this worship of God. And I think what took place in chapter 6 was the breakdown of that. That suddenly, there's no more godly line. Everything is compromised. And in fact, that word compromise is a big deal. I think this was the precursor of the flood that followed, because I think what happened is, at this point, you had to say, what's going to happen to the line of the Messiah? So I think this is really an important point, that none of us maybe can figure out these verses, and we probably won't ever know on this earth, but there's one thing that I think really is important to understand, that from the time of Eden, from the time of Adam and Eve to the time of Noah in chapter 6. I mean, we're talking here about, in the scope of world history, it's not that long. You know, we're just talking about this small amount of time history-wise, and yet everything had fallen apart just in that time. It took no time for men to become wicked, and that wickedness started with compromise. It was compromise in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and then later it was compromise with their children. And I think what we're seeing right here is this sexual compromise. I think what was happening is that instead of, that for these Sethites, that instead of looking for other people who worshiped the Lord so that they could join a union with somebody who was also a God follower, I think what happened instead is that they followed their own lust. They followed their own inflamed lust, and as a result, everything eroded, and faith started to erode. There was this massive compromise, and it became so bad that God was angry, and God was grieved. Look at, if you've got your Bible in front of you, look at verses 5 and 8. This is how bad it got. The Lord saw that the extent of human wickedness on the earth, He observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and He saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. Like every thought of every person, that they were just pushing away from God. And so the Lord was sorry He had ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke His heart. And the Lord said, I will wipe out this human race I've created from the face of the earth. Yes, I'll destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, even the birds of the sky. I'm sorry I ever even made them. I mean, this is almost like God saying, you know, this thing is haywire. I'm just going to unplug it and plug it back in again. I'm going to start over again. Now, I'm really interested in the verse there in verse 6 when it says, so the Lord was sorry He had ever made them, because then you start to question, so does that mean God changed His mind? And of course, in Numbers, it says, God is not a man, so He does not lie, and He's not a human, so He does not change His mind. Has He ever spoken and failed to act? Has He ever promised and not carried it through? I mean, the writer of Numbers there, Moses, same writer says, God doesn't change His mind, not like you think of it. 1 Samuel, and He who is the glory of Israel will not lie, nor will He change His mind, for He is not a human that He should change His mind. And yet, you could point to places in Scripture where it sure seems like He did. I mean, what about Sodom and Gomorrah? When He said to Abraham, I'm going to destroy those cities, and Abraham basically said, look, God, wouldn't you spare the city for 30 righteous people? What about 20? What about 10? And God continued to relent along the way. What about when God told Jonah, I'm going to destroy the Ninevites, and then the Ninevites repented and God changed His mind? See, I think what's happening here is that you've got to understand that God's mind is so much bigger than ours. We just read verses that said God can't change His mind, and yet what the author's doing is he's comparing God's actions to man's to help us to understand Him. In other words, he's saying this is how it looks from God's perspective. For instance, in Genesis 22 and Exodus 32, God proposed a test for people. It's not like His eternal purpose changed. Sometimes where either judgment or blessings are promised, there might be an implied or a stated condition. So like when Jonah preached judgment on Nineveh, there was a condition. He said, look, if you repent, then I'll relent. God promised to bring His people into the land of Canaan. But then due to the unbelief of the first generation, they didn't possess the land, but the second generation did. I mean, it's like there was a condition there. When Jesus came, He offered Himself to Israel as the Messiah. When Israel rejected Jesus, that made it possible for the offer of the gospel to go to the Gentiles. Now, did God change His mind? Well, no, because when God's purpose for the Gentiles had been accomplished, He's going to turn and pour His grace and salvation upon the Jews. And I guess the point here is God's program changes, but not His purposes. God's will does not change, not His ultimate will. But He is free to change His emotions. And God mourns over sin. Remember, God is not stoic. He has emotions. So His purpose for mankind never changed here. God has said from the beginning, I am going to save mankind. His ultimate will did not change. But His permissive will had allowed people to act like they acted, and His attitude changed. And these verses show that God is grieved about man's sin. He's grieved over its consequences. The same thing happens with us. There's lots of things that happen in your life that you maybe turn your eyes up to God and you say, God, why did you do this? And God would say, I didn't do it, but I grieve with you. When our hearts break, God's heart breaks. Sometimes God is angry. Sometimes God rejoices with us. God has emotions. And what's happening in this moment is that God is looking at this earth, and in His permissive will, God has allowed people to make choices based on our own free will. God has allowed that because we were created in His image. And so God's permissive will is not what His intended will is. I mean, God is allowing something to happen that would not be His will, and yet His ultimate will is what He promised in the Garden of Eden. I am going to send a Messiah. That's not going to change. But in this moment, He realizes that because of the wickedness of the earth, He's going to respond to that. And He's going to keep this line of the Messiah alive, which is why after all of those verses where God says, I'm so grieved and I'm going to wipe out everybody, I'm going to destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals, even the birds of the sky, I'm sorry I ever made them. At the end of all of that, in verse 8, it says, but Noah found favor with God. And right there is grace. Right in the middle of all of that, you see God's ultimate will, because He has kept a little remnant, the smallest remnant ever maybe. And in that remnant is the flame of the Messiah, who's going to finally reconcile this world back to what God intended it. All right, so this is complicated stuff because we're talking here about God's will, and we're talking about very mysterious things that were happening. But on the surface, here's the 5-minute theology of this. Compromise had led people far away from God. And God now is grieved because wickedness has just overtaken the whole land. And here's the Messiah, the line of the Messiah, and God is keeping His hand over that and protecting it. So what these verses show us, first of all, is a reason for the flood. We can see why God felt the need to deluge the earth. It was all about protecting the line of the Messiah and keeping His word. And we can see how it got to this point. It got to this point because even the people who were following God now had followed their own lust and turned away from Him. And in a way, I guess these verses help us to understand our present world too. Because if you look around right now and ask yourself the state of our world, it's kind of depressing, isn't it? But even now, God has preserved in this world a large number of people who bow to Him. And those are the people who we call the bride of Christ, the church. In our day, though, many people inside of the church have compromised, just like God's people did in those days. Many people inside of the church are following their own lust and turning from God. And see, these are marks in Romans 2. These are the marks of the last two churches that are listed there. Churches that, in Revelation 2. These are marks of the last two churches written there. Churches that compromise, especially sexually. They compromise based on their own passions and their own lust. And the point is that once people decide, and especially once a culture decides to follow lustful desires above God, then the gate is opened for every other compromise, because we can justify every other thing if we enthrone our own lust. And I think that we all see that happening inside of the church right now. And I think that there are some tough days ahead for the church, as the church really has to be refined. Because we've allowed, inside of the church, we've allowed ourselves to be pulled so far by our hearts. And the problem is, if the church isn't refined, then it will lose its voice. And as it loses its voice, then the depravity in the culture around us only increases. And see, that's what was happening in Noah's day. As people compromised, these voices of truth were silenced until there was nothing, just darkness. So we're able to see from these verses, even what was happening at that point, why God felt the need to do what He did. We also get maybe an understanding of what's going on around us, and in a sense, it gives us a glimpse of the future. Because God judged the earth in the past, he's also going to judge it again in the future. And not only that, but when he was teaching about future judgment, do you remember what Jesus said? He said, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of man. Jesus said, here's what it will be like. Jesus, tell us what it will be like in the last days. And Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be like in the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus said, one day is going to be like that again. And you remember what Moses said that was like? He said, every thought was evil all the time. Every thought was evil all the time. That's a big statement. If you want some perspective on that, go back. I read these verses last week. I won't read them again, but go back and read the last 14 verses of Romans 1, and Paul will describe that in more detail. But this is a great statement, a great statement to describe it. Every thought was evil all the time. And yet still in the midst of that, God showed grace. Remember? But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. In the middle of all of that, here's grace. And so next week, we'll talk about who he was and how he set about obeying God. And I think it will be really reassuring next week. Look, I know we talked about some hard things this week, and I kind of did it in a fast way. If you are interested in hearing some theories about the Nephilim, if you really would like to have some more thoughts about that, because I kind of glossed over that quickly, I have a handout that I would be happy to send you. And I'm not saying it's not like reading a textbook. It's about a 1.5-page handout. But it's something I put together to teach a class several years ago. If you'd like to see that, just email me, Matthew@Pinedale.church. I'll send it to you. And if you have some questions or would like to talk, give me a call. There's nobody who's an expert on that topic, but I'd be happy to chat with you. In the meantime, I hope you have a great ending to the week. Let's continue to pray for our country, man. We need it. Let's continue to pray for our church and for the church, and pray that God will work in this time right now to refine and retool and re-equip his church for the next season in our country's history. God bless you. I'd like to pray with you. Lord, we live in weird times right now. But Father, I want to thank you for your grace and your goodness, that even in the midst of this wickedness, Father, that you're at work. And so, Lord, use us, give us eyes to see you above all the stuff around us. Forgive us, Lord, for when we've compromised or winked at compromise. Lord, help us to be people instead who are passionate about you. And Jesus, we ask this in your name. Amen.